An elderly woman is told she can't afford a meal, but then the chef's actions leave everyone speechless. The late afternoon sun cast golden rays through the windows of a small upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, the scent of fresh bread and slow-cooked sauces filling the air. Margaret Dawson, a frail elderly woman with silver hair neatly tied back, stepped inside, her eyes scanning the menu hanging near the entrance. She clutched a small, worn-out purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she counted the few bills she had. She wasn't here for luxury, just a warm meal, something to fill her stomach. But as she stepped forward, her presence caught the attention of a young waiter behind the counter. His gaze flickered over her simple, worn-out coat, the way she hesitated before approaching. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, forcing a polite smile. "Can I help you?" Margaret cleared her throat softly. "Yes, dear. I was wondering if I could have the daily special. Just something simple, please." The waiter's eyes darted toward the manager standing nearby. The manager, a tall man in a pressed suit, approached with a skeptical glance at Margaret's modest attire. He sighed, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, our meals are a bit pricey," he said, forcing a tight smile. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." The words stung, but Margaret kept her posture straight. She had faced hardships before, but nothing quite like this. A public humiliation over something as basic as a meal. The quiet murmurs of nearby customers made it clear that people had noticed. Some turned away in discomfort, while others pretended not to hear. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, not from anger, but from shame. She had spent decades working as a nurse, caring for others, never asking for anything in return, and now, in the twilight of her life, she couldn't even sit down for a warm meal without being judged. She swallowed hard, ready to turn and leave, when a deep voice cut through the awkward silence. "Is there a problem here?" The kitchen doors swung open, and a man in a white chef's coat stepped forward, his presence commanding, his eyes sharp. The name stitched onto his uniform read, Daniel Laurent. But to the restaurant staff, he was more than just a chef. He was the owner. And at that moment, his expression made it clear that he wasn't happy. Chef Daniel stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron, his sharp eyes locking onto the manager. The entire restaurant went silent, waiting to see what would happen next. The manager shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Chef, I was just explaining to this woman that our meals are quite expensive and—" Daniel held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His gaze softened as he turned toward Margaret, who stood frozen, clutching her purse. She looked embarrassed, as if she wanted to disappear. "Ma'am," Daniel said gently, "please, have a seat. You're welcome here." Margaret hesitated. "I don't want to cause any trouble," she whispered. "I just wanted something small." Daniel shook his head. "You're not causing trouble, but someone here is." His voice dropped slightly, and the manager instinctively took a step back. Without another word, Daniel turned on his heel and disappeared into the kitchen. The restaurant staff exchanged confused glances. Was he really going to serve her? For free? Minutes later, he returned, holding a steaming plate of food. Not just any meal, but the chef's special, plated with the same care as if it were for the most important guest in the restaurant. He set it down in front of Margaret, who stared at it, her eyes welling with tears. "This is for you," Daniel said, pulling out a chair for her. "On the house." The manager looked horrified. "Sir, you can't just—" Daniel turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Do you know who this woman is?" The manager blinked. "What?" Daniel folded his arms. "I do. And if you knew, you'd be ashamed of how you just treated her." The entire restaurant watched in stunned silence. What did Chef Daniel know about this elderly woman? Why was he speaking as if she was someone important? The restaurant was completely silent. The customers, the waitstaff, even the manager, all eyes were locked on Chef Daniel as he stood beside Margaret, his words hanging heavy in the air. What did he mean? Who was she? Margaret looked up at him, confused. She had never met this man before, or so she thought. Daniel turned back to the, stunned manager. "Before you turn someone away, maybe you should know who they are. This woman is the reason I'm standing here today." The manager's face twisted in confusion. "Sir, But Daniel wasn't listening. He turned back to Margaret, his voice softer now. "You don't remember me, do you?" Margaret's brow furrowed. She studied his face, the deep lines of his jaw, the warmth in his eyes. There was something familiar, something distant, like a memory just out of reach. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Should I?" Daniel smiled, though his eyes glistened with something deeper. 30 years ago, I was a scared little boy, in a hospital bed. My mother was crying because she couldn't afford my treatment. She thought she was going to lose me. Margaret's heart skipped. A hospital? 30 years ago? She had been a nurse for most of her life, caring for countless patients, comforting families, offering kindness where she could. Daniel continued, but a nurse stepped in, a nurse who refused to let my mother suffer alone. She fought for me. She spoke to the doctors, found a way to get my treatment covered. She stayed by my bedside even when she didn't have to. Margaret's breath hitched. She clutched the edge of the table, realization creeping in. You, Daniel said, kneeling beside her. You saved my life. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as the memory came rushing back. The young boy with a weak heartbeat, his mother sobbing at his bedside, the desperate look in her eyes when she had told Margaret she had no money. Margaret had fought for that boy, called in favors, made sure he got what he needed. And now, all these years later, that same boy had grown into the man before her. The manager, now looking utterly ashamed, cleared his throat. Chef, I didn't know. Daniel turned to him sharply. No, you didn't. But you should have treated her with kindness regardless. Margaret, overwhelmed with emotion, reached for Daniel's hand. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand gently. Of course I did. You taught me what kindness looks like. And now, it's my turn. The restaurant remained in stunned silence. No one would ever forget what had just happened. Margaret's hands trembled as she held Daniel's, her mind racing back to that day so many years ago. She had never expected to see that little boy again, let alone in a moment like this. The weight of it all was almost too much. You saved me, Daniel repeated, his voice filled with gratitude. And now I finally have the chance to do something for you. The entire restaurant was watching, and the manager, who had once looked so smug, was now staring at the floor, clearly ashamed. The customers who had silently witnessed Margaret's humiliation just minutes ago now felt guilt creeping in. Margaret sniffled, a small smile forming on her lips. You don't owe me anything, dear. Helping people, that was just my job. Daniel shook his head. No, it was more than that. You didn't just do your job, you gave a scared little boy a chance at life. That's not something I can ever forget. He gestured toward the waiter, who immediately hurried to clear a special table in the center of the restaurant. Within minutes, a beautiful meal was placed before Margaret. Not just a simple plate of food, but the best dish the restaurant had to offer. This meal is on me, Daniel said firmly, and every meal you ever want to have here will always be on me. Margaret's lips parted in shock. Oh no, I couldn't. You can, Daniel interrupted gently, because this restaurant only exists because you gave me the chance to grow up and chase my dreams. A hush fell over the room. No one could believe what they were hearing. The customers who had judged Margaret for her appearance now watched with quiet admiration. Some even wiped their eyes, moved by the realization that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A full-circle moment of kindness repaid. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the diners stood up. A well-dressed man near the window pulled out his wallet and waved to the waiter. I want to cover someone's meal tonight, he said, his voice steady. Because kindness like this, it shouldn't stop here. Another diner stood up. Me too. Then another, and another. One by one, the entire restaurant began to pay it forward, covering meals for strangers, offering small gestures of kindness, turning what had started as a moment of cruelty into something far more beautiful. Margaret, overwhelmed, covered her mouth with her hand. Her one small act of kindness, decades ago, had created a ripple effect that she never could have imagined. Margaret sat frozen, her heart swelling as she watched strangers, people who had initially ignored or judged her, now standing up to pay for each other's meals, moved by the moment unfolding before them. She had never imagined that a single act of kindness from years ago would lead to this, to an entire restaurant filled with generosity and compassion. Daniel knelt beside her, his warm smile never fading. You see, Margaret, kindness doesn't just stop, it spreads. You changed my life, and now, because of you, this is happening. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. All her life she had given to others, often without knowing if her kindness ever made a difference. But now, she could see it, feel it. A woman approached her table, holding her young daughter's hand. Excuse me, she said softly. I just wanted to say, your story touched me. My mother was a nurse too, and she always told me that kindness should be given freely. Thank you for reminding us of that today. Margaret reached out, gently squeezing the woman's hand. Thank you, dear, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Then, the manager, who had originally dismissed her, stepped forward, his face still red with embarrassment. He cleared his throat before speaking. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. His usual arrogance was gone. I judged you unfairly, and I shouldn't have. You are welcome here any time. Margaret nodded, offering him a small, forgiving smile. It wasn't about the apology. It was about the lesson learned. Daniel clapped his hands together, drawing everyone's attention back to him. Now, before we wrap up this incredible night, there's just one more thing. He turned to Margaret, his eyes twinkling. She blinked in surprise. More? Daniel gestured toward the entrance. I have a gift for you. The doors swung open and a young man in a chef's uniform walked in, carrying something small but meaningful, a plaque engraved with Margaret's name. It read, "In honor of Margaret Dawson, whose kindness changed lives." Margaret gasped. Her name would now be a permanent part of the restaurant. You are the reason I became who I am today, Daniel said. And I want everyone who walks into this place to know your name, to remember what kindness looks like. Margaret stared at the plaque in the young chef's hands, her lips trembling as she read the words engraved in gold. Her name, her kindness, her legacy, forever honored in this place. The restaurant had once been just another stop in her long journey through life, but now it was something more. The room erupted into applause. People weren't just clapping for the gesture, they were clapping for her, for a life spent in quiet service, for the love she had given without expectation, for the impact she had made without even knowing. Daniel helped her to her feet, his grip steady, reassuring. Margaret, this is just a small way to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But your kindness, that can never be repaid. Margaret wiped at the tears in her eyes, shaking her head with a soft laugh. All I ever wanted was to help people. That's enough for me. Daniel smiled. And that's exactly why you deserve this. One by one, customers came forward to thank her. A father who had lost his job but was gifted a meal that night. A woman who had struggled to believe in kindness until today. A young couple who had been inspired to pay it forward to someone else. The restaurant, once filled with quiet indifference, was now alive with warmth. Strangers shared tables, people exchanged stories, and the staff moved with a new sense of purpose. The moment had transformed not just one person's evening, but an entire community's perspective on kindness. As the night came to a close, Daniel walked Margaret to the door. The city lights twinkled in the distance, the air cool against her skin. She turned to him, still overwhelmed, still processing the whirlwind of emotions. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Daniel simply squeezed her hand. You already said it, Margaret. You said it when you saved my life all those years ago, and you say it every time you show kindness to someone. She looked up at him, pride shining in her tired eyes. Then promise me something, dear. Anything. Margaret smiled. Keep doing this. Keep proving that kindness is worth more than anything money can buy. Daniel nodded. Always. As she stepped outside, Margaret took one last look at the restaurant, the place that had once humiliated her. Now, a symbol of something greater. She had walked in alone, unseen, overlooked, but she was walking out as a reminder to everyone inside that kindness never goes unnoticed, and somewhere, in the hearts of those who had witnessed it all, a ripple effect had begun.